The wind howled like a wounded beast through the Bitterroot Mountains when he found her half buried in the snow. "Get into my cabin, it's freezing outside," Caleb shouted over the roaring blizzard. She was shivering violently, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest like her life depended on it. He thought he was saving a helpless traveler from a cruel winter grave. He had no idea that bringing this desperate woman into his isolated sanctuary would invite a deadly storm of a completely different kind. The winter of 1887 was not just a season, it was a punishment. Folks down in the valleys of the Montana Territory would later call it the Great Die-Up, a time when the mercury plummeted so low that trees shattered in the forest like glass and cattle froze standing up. Up in the Bitterroot Range, the isolation was total. For Caleb Hayes, that isolation was the entire point. Caleb was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he called home. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that caught the frost and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky, he had spent the last 5 years living completely off the grid. A former deputy marshal out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, Caleb had seen enough of the world's greed, corruption, and senseless violence to last him 10 lifetimes. After a bullet took his brother during a bank job gone wrong, a job orchestrated by the very mayor they were sworn to protect, Caleb handed in his 10-star, packed his meager belongings, and rode high into the timberline. He traded the bloody complexities of civilization for the brutal, honest simplicity of survival. On the third day of the great blizzard, the wind was screaming. Caleb was stacking the last of his chopped cordwood against the thick, weather-stripped door of his cabin. The temperature was dropping fast, the air so frigid it burned his lungs with every breath. He was just about to pull the heavy iron latch and seal himself in for the duration of the storm when he heard it. It wasn't the shriek of the wind nor the howling of a starved timber wolf. It was a sharp, pathetic gasp, followed by a dull thud. Caleb froze, his hand on the latch. He squinted through the blinding curtain of white. Visibility was less than 10 feet. He pulled his heavy buffalo hide coat tighter around his neck, grabbed his Winchester from just inside the door, and stepped off the porch, sinking waist-deep into the powder. I waded through the drift, following the faint disruption in the snow crust. Near the edge of the tree line, beneath the heavy, sagging boughs of an ancient blue spruce, he found her. She was a small heap of dark wool and snow, lying face down. Caleb dropped his rifle and hauled her over. Her face was as pale as marble, her lips tinged a dangerous, bruised blue. She wore a heavy velvet riding habit and a wool coat, garments meant for a brisk carriage-riding bowsman, not for surviving a sub-zero blizzard in the high country. But the most striking thing was her grip. Even unconscious, her frostbitten fingers were locked in a death grip around a heavy, brass-clasped leather satchel. "Hey!" Caleb barked, shaking her shoulders. "Hey, wake up!" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of dark amber, glassy and unfocused. She tried to pull away from him, a weak, frantic thrashing, her hands pulling the satchel tighter against her breast. "Get into my cabin, it's freezing outside," Caleb shouted, though he knew she could barely hear him over the gale. When she collapsed back into the snow, completely spent, Caleb didn't waste another second. He scooped her up in his arms. She weighed practically nothing, a fragile bird caught in a hurricane. He trudged back to the cabin, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them and throwing the iron bolt, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. The cabin was a sanctuary of heat. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, roaring with a thick pitch pine fire. Caleb carried her to the only bed in the room, a sturdy frame laced with rope and piled high with thick bear and wolf pelts. He set her down and immediately went to work. Survival in the cold was a race against time. He knew if he warmed her too fast, the shock could stop her heart. He started by peeling away the frozen, stiff layers of her outer coat. She flinched, moaning in protest, her hands blindly fighting him to protect the bag. "I'm not taking your damn bag, lady," Caleb muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet cabin. "I'm trying to save your life." He managed to pry the satchel away, setting it carefully on the floor beside the bed. He removed her ruined boots and her frozen stockings, revealing feet that were pale and icy to the touch. He fetched a basin of lukewarm water, not hot, never hot, and began the slow, agonizing process of massaging life back into her extremities. For hours, the only sounds in the cabin were the popping of the fire, the muffled fury of the blizzard beating against the logs, and her shallow, ragged breathing. Caleb sat beside her, constantly monitoring her pulse, forcing small spoonfuls of warm beef broth past her chattering teeth whenever she aroused enough to swallow. As the evening wore on, the blue tinge faded from her lips, replaced by the angry red flush of returning blood. She began to shiver violently, a good sign. It meant her body was fighting back. Caleb pulled a chair near the fire, a cup of bitter black coffee in his hands, and finally took a good look at his uninvited guest. Stripped of her heavy outer layers, dressed in a simple, rumpled white cotton blouse and dark skirt, she looked out of place. Her hands caught his attention. They were delicate, yes, but not the idle hands of a wealthy socialite. The side of her right index finger bore a distinct dark callus, and there were faint, permanent ink stains near her fingernails. She was a woman who worked with a pen. Then he looked at the satchel. It was heavy, crafted from expensive cordovan leather, and secured with a heavy brass padlock. Who was she? And what was a woman like her doing wandering the deadliest peaks of the Montana Territory on foot in the middle of the worst blizzard of the decade? Before Caleb could ponder further, a sharp gasp drew his attention back to the bed. The woman was sitting bolt upright, her amber eyes wide with blind panic, scanning the room frantically. "My bag," she choked out, her voice raspy and raw. "Where is it?" "Right here," Caleb said smoothly, staying seated so as not to startle her. He nudged the heavy leather satchel with the toe of his boot. She scrambled to the edge of the bed, her trembling hands dropping over the side to brush against the leather. Only when she felt the brass lock did her shoulders drop in a heavy sigh of relief. She looked up at Caleb, really seeing him for the first time, the sheer size of him, the rugged face, the heavy revolver holstered on the chair beside him. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Caleb, Caleb Hayes. You're in my home." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "You want to tell me what you're doing trespassing on a mountain that's actively trying to kill you?" She stared at him, pulling the thick bear pelt up to her chin. "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Clara Jenkins. And I wasn't trespassing. I was running." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Running from what?" Clara looked away, her eyes fixing on the dancing flames in the hearth. "The cold," she lied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just the cold." For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard held them hostage. The wind battered the small cabin relentlessly, piling snowdrifts against the windows until the interior was plunged into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the warm, flickering glow of the hearth. In the tight confines of the cabin, an uneasy truce settled between the mountain man and the fugitive. Clara Jenkins was a puzzle Caleb couldn't easily solve. Despite her near brush with death, she recovered with a quiet, stubborn resilience. By the second day, she was out of bed, insisting on helping with the chores. She swept the rough plank floors, mended a tear in one of Caleb's wool shirts with surprising dexterity, and took over the cooking, transforming his monotonous supplies of salted pork, dried beans, and flour into hearty, flavorful stews and biscuits. Yet, the silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken questions. Clara was fiercely guarded. She never moved more than a few feet away from the locked leather satchel, often placing it under her pillow when she slept. Caleb, for his part, didn't press her. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to know that you don't corner a frightened animal. He chopped wood in the small attached lean-to, cleaned his rifles, and watched her. He noted the way she jumped at the sudden crack and hiss of a shifting log in the fire. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion of a woman who had been looking over her shoulder for far too long. On the evening of the third day, the cabin fever began to break, thawing the ice between them. They were sitting by the fire, eating from tin plates. The wind outside had finally begun to quiet down, reducing its furious roar to a low, mournful sigh. "This is good," Caleb said suddenly, breaking an hour of silence. He gestured to the stew. "Best meal I've had in a long time. Usually my cooking tastes like boots." Clara offered a small, hesitant smile. It transformed her face, softening the sharp edges of her fear. "My father owned a boarding house back in St. Louis," she said quietly. "I spent half my childhood in the kitchen. You learn quickly when you're feeding 20 hungry railway men every night." "St. Louis," Caleb mused. "That's a long way from the Bitterroots. How'd you end up out here, Clara Jenkins?" Her smile vanished, replaced by the familiar guarded mask. She set her plate down, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "Circumstances," she murmured. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Circumstances don't drive a woman to walk into a blizzard alone, clutching a bag like it's her firstborn child. Men do. Bad men." Clara's eyes flashed with a sudden defensive fire. "You don't know anything about me, Mr. Hayes, or what I'm dealing with." "I know you're terrified," Caleb said softly, his deep voice carrying a rare gentle cadence. "I know every time the wind hits the door, you look at my rifle before you look at me. And I know that out here, secrets are a luxury that usually ends up getting people killed." He expected her to get angry, to retreat to her corner of the cabin. Instead, the fight seemed to drain right out of her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, Caleb saw the sheer, crushing weight of what she was carrying. "Have you ever heard of Josiah Miller?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I know the name. He runs a massive cattle and railroad syndicate down in Bozeman, owns half the judges in the territory. The other half are too scared to look his way." "I worked for him," Clara confessed, her eyes opening to meet his. "I was his senior bookkeeper. He hired me because he thought a woman wouldn't ask questions. For 2 years, I managed the ledgers for his legitimate businesses." She swallowed hard. "But a month ago, his private safe was left unlatched. I looked inside. I found the real ledgers." Caleb went completely still. What kind of ledgers? Deeds to ranches of men who supposedly died of accidents or Native American raids. Payments made to the local sheriff, Wyatt Mercer, to look the other way. And a payroll. Clara's voice shook. A payroll for hired killers. Josiah isn't just buying up the valley, Caleb. He's slaughtering anyone who refuses to sell to the railroad. Caleb sat back, the puzzle pieces finally snapping together. The ink stains, the callus. She wasn't just a runaway. She was the most dangerous thing in the Montana Territory to a man like Josiah Miller, a witness with proof. "That satchel," Caleb said, his eyes shifting to the heavy leather bag. "The genuine ledgers," Clara confirmed, "and signed affidavits I stole from his private desk, enough to hang Josiah Miller and half the territorial government. I was trying to make it across the mountains to Helena to a federal judge I know is clean." "Josiah won't let you get to Helena," Caleb warned. "He'll send hunters." "He already has," Clara whispered, a tear finally escaping to track down her pale cheek. "He sent Declan Boyd." The name hit the cabin like a physical blow. Declan Boyd was a ghost story whispered around campfires. A former Pinkerton detective who was dismissed for his excessive cruelty, Boyd had turned to bounty hunting. He didn't just track his prey, he tortured them, breaking them down for the sheer sport of it before dragging them back. "Boyd caught my trail in the foothills," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "I had to abandon my horse to lose him in the timberline. Then the storm hit. If you hadn't found me—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Caleb stood up, grabbing the heavy iron poker to stir the dying embers of the fire. His mind was racing, instantly slipping back into the tactical mindset he thought he had left behind in Cheyenne. The storm is breaking, Caleb said, his voice flat and authoritative. By tomorrow morning, the passes will be clear enough for tracking. Boyd is a bloodhound. The snow will cover your tracks from 3 days ago, but if he checks the valleys and finds your frozen horse, he'll start working his way up the ridge. He'll look for smoke. He'll look for shelter. Clara stood up, panic flaring in her eyes again. Then I have to leave, now, before the sun comes up. You wouldn't make it 2 miles in waist-deep snow, Caleb countered harshly. You're still recovering from frostbite. I won't bring that monster to your door, Clara argued, stepping toward him. You saved my life, Caleb. I am not going to repay you by putting a target on your back. Caleb turned to look at her, genuinely surprised by the fierce, selfless conviction in her amber eyes. He had spent years seeing the worst of humanity, watching people betray one another for a handful of silver or an acre of land. Yet here was a woman, terrified and hunted, willing to walk back out into the freezing wilderness just to spare a stranger who had taken her in. He took a step closer to her, his large, rough hands gently grasping her shoulders. You're not going anywhere, Clara. I left the world below 'cause I was sick of men like Josiah Miller and Declan Boyd acting like gods. I swore I'd never get involved in their blood feuds again. He looked deep into her eyes, his voice steady as bedrock. But I'll be damned to hell if I let a piece of filth like Boyd take you off my mountain. Dawn broke over the Bitterroots with a blinding crystalline brilliance. The blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind a world buried in pristine, untouched white. The sky was an aggressive, cloudless blue, and the air was dead still, so cold it felt brittle. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Caleb was in full preparation mode. He had barred the heavy wooden shutters over the cabin's 2 small windows, leaving only narrow slats for a rifle barrel. He was meticulously oiling the lever action of his Winchester 1873, a box of brass cartridges sitting open on the rough-hewn table. Beside it lay his Colt Peacemaker and a heavy, double-barreled shotgun. Clara watched him from the edge of the bed. She had dressed in her dried, mended clothing, her boots laced tight. The leather satchel sat on her lap. She watched the methodical, deadly grace with which Caleb handled his weapons. He wasn't just a mountain man. He was a warrior preparing for a siege. You're a lawman, she stated, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Caleb paused, sliding a cartridge into the loading gate with a sharp metallic clack. Was a deputy marshal in Cheyenne a long time ago. Why did you leave? Because the badge is just a piece of tin, Caleb said bitterly, not looking up. It doesn't stop the men who own the banks from stealing, and it doesn't stop the men who write the laws from breaking them. I lost my brother trying to uphold a law that was rigged from the start. He looked up at her then, his blue eyes piercing. I came up here for peace. And I brought a war to your doorstep, Clara said softly, guilt radiating from her. You brought the truth, Caleb corrected, and sometimes the truth requires a fight. Suddenly, the stillness of the morning was shattered. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the dead silence of the snow-covered mountain, it carried for miles. It was the sharp, distinct snap of a dry branch breaking under a heavy hoof, followed by the faint, rhythmic panting of a large hound. Caleb was instantly at the window, peering through the narrow slat. Get down, he ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. Clara slid off the bed, crouching behind the thick oak table. Is it him? 2 riders, Caleb reported, his eyes narrowed against the glaring snow. Coming up the main trail, they've got a bloodhound on a long lead, and one of them is wearing a duster carrying a Sharps buffalo rifle. Declan Boyd, Clara breathed, her blood running cold. The stories of his cruelty flooded her mind. She knew what he would do. He wouldn't just kill Caleb. He would make an example of him for daring to harbor her. He would burn the cabin to the ground. Caleb stepped back from the window, grabbing his Winchester. They're about 300 yards out, working their way up the switchback. I can pick one off from the window, but Boyd is smart. He'll take cover in the rocks and wait us out. We've got enough food and wood for a month, but if he sets fire to the roof... As Caleb calculated firing angles and sightlines, his back turned to her, Clara made her decision. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the ice, a man who had isolated himself to escape violence, now willingly standing between her and a killer. She couldn't let his blood be on her hands. Caleb turned back around to hand her the Colt. Take this, keep it pointed at the door. If anyone comes through that isn't me... Caleb stopped dead. Clara was standing up from behind the table, but she wasn't reaching for the Colt. Instead, she had unbuttoned the top of her blouse, reaching into a hidden pocket. In her hand, leveled perfectly steady at Caleb's chest, was a small, nickel-plated Remington Derringer. Caleb stared at the tiny twin-barreled gun, completely blindsided. The mountain man, who had just prepared for a war with a ruthless bounty hunter, was now being held at gunpoint by the woman he had saved. Clara, Caleb said slowly, his voice a low, dangerous warning. What the hell are you doing? Put the rifle down on the table, Caleb, Clara said, her voice shaking slightly, though her hand remained perfectly still. Are you out of your mind? Caleb demanded, his grip on the Winchester tightening. Boyd is less than 5 minutes away. Put that toy down before you get us both killed. I mean it, Caleb, Clara shouted, a tear spilling over her lashes. Put the rifle down, or I swear to God I will shoot you in the leg. Slowly reading the absolute desperate conviction in her eyes, Caleb lowered the Winchester, laying it flat on the table. He raised his hands, his mind reeling. Had she played him? Was she working with Boyd all along? Was this a trap? Now step away from the table, she ordered. Caleb took 2 steps back. Clara didn't grab the rifle. Instead, she moved quickly to the door, keeping the Derringer pointed at him. She grabbed her leather satchel with her free hand, slinging it over her shoulder. I lied to you, Caleb, Clara said, her voice breaking. I told you I was just a bookkeeper, but I'm not stupid. I know how men like Boyd operate. Clara, stop, Caleb pleaded, finally understanding the madness in her eyes. It wasn't betrayal, it was sacrifice. I won't let you die for me, she sobbed, backing toward the heavy iron latch of the door. Boyd wants the ledgers and he wants me. If he finds me out there running, he won't care about this cabin. He'll take me and go back to Bozeman to collect his pay. You stay here, you stay safe. He'll torture you to death, Clara. He'll kill you. Then let him, she screamed back, her facade crumbling. You gave up everything to find peace up here. I am not going to be the reason you lose it. Do not follow me, Caleb. I mean it. With a swift, desperate motion, Clara threw the iron bolt, pulled the door open, and bolted out into the blinding snow. Caleb stood frozen in the center of the cabin for exactly 1 second. The move had changed everything. In all his years as a lawman, he had seen cowards, thieves, and murderers. He had never in his entire life had someone pull a gun on him to save his life. The door hung open, the freezing mountain air rushing in, carrying the distant echoing bark of Boyd's bloodhound. Caleb looked at the open door, then down at his empty hands. A slow, dangerous fire ignited in his chest, burning away the last 5 years of apathy and isolation. The lawman wasn't dead. He had just been sleeping. Caleb snatched the Winchester off the table, scooped up his Colt, and racked the lever of the rifle. Not today, Boyd, Caleb growled to the empty room. He stepped out of the cabin, disappearing into the blinding white of the mountains, plunging headfirst into the war he had sworn to avoid. The cold hit Clara like a physical blow the second she cleared the timberline. The snow crust, hardened by the sub-zero night, held her weight for a few steps before her boots broke through. plunging her waist-deep into the powder. Every movement was a grueling battle against the mountain. She clutched the heavy cordovan leather satchel to her chest, her breath pluming in terrified, ragged clouds in the brittle morning air. Keep moving, she told herself. Draw them away. She aimed for the lower ridge, away from Caleb's cabin, hoping to leave a wide, unmistakable trench in the snow that Declan Boyd's tracker couldn't miss. But her frostbite-weakened limbs were already burning, her lungs searing with the icy air. She had barely made it 200 yards when the exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Down in the valley below, the sharp, triumphant bark of a bloodhound echoed against the granite walls. They had found her trail. Clara scrambled toward a cluster of massive, snow-laden boulders, dragging herself onto a flat, wind-swept ledge. She collapsed against the freezing stone, gasping for air, her small nickel-plated derringer trembling in her hand. She checked the 2 chambers. 2 bullets, not enough to fight off 2 armed men, but enough for a final act of defiance. She would not let Boyd take the ledgers, and she would certainly not let him take her back to Josiah Miller alive. Easy, Brutus, easy now, boy, we got her. The voice slithered up the ridge, a smooth, heavily accented drawl that made Clara's blood turn to ice water. It was the voice of a man who enjoyed his work a little too much. From behind the cover of the rocks, Clara peeked over the snowy edge. Less than 50 yards below, 2 men on horseback were navigating the treacherous slope. The man in front, leading the massive slavering bloodhound, was a hired tracker, a wiry, filthy man wrapped in furs, a rusted Springfield rifle resting across his saddle pommel. But it was the man behind him that made Clara's breath hitch. Declan Boyd sat tall in the saddle, wearing a long black canvas duster that seemed to absorb the blinding sunlight. He was a striking man, with silver hair pulled back tight and a neatly trimmed beard, looking more like an aristocrat than a butcher. But his eyes, pale, dead, and utterly devoid of mercy, gave him away. A heavy Sharps buffalo rifle rested in a custom saddle scabbard, and twin Colt revolvers hung low on his hips. She went up that draw, Mr. Boyd. The tracker, a man named Grover, pointed with a mittened hand. Tracks are fresh, ain't 10 minutes old. Boyd spurred his horse forward, his pale eyes scanning the boulders where Clara hid. Well now, Miss Jenkins, Boyd called out, his voice projecting effortlessly through the crisp air. You have led us on a merry chase. I have to admit, I didn't think a city girl had it in her to survive a Bitterroot freeze. But playtime is over. Come on out. Hand over Mr. Miller's property, and I'll make sure you get a warm blanket before the ride down. Clara pressed her back against the stone, squeezing her eyes shut. She tightened her grip on the derringer. She didn't make a sound. Don't be foolish, Clara. Boyd's voice grew harder, the false politeness evaporating. Grover here isn't known for his patience, and my dog is terribly hungry. Walk out now, or I'll let the hound drag you out by your throat. Grover unclipped the heavy chain from the bloodhound's collar. The massive dog let out a vicious snarl, catching Clara's scent on the wind, and began bounding up the deep snow toward the boulders. Clara stood up, bracing her arms on the rock, pointing her tiny derringer at the charging beast. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it. This was the end. Suddenly, the sharp, deafening crack of a Winchester 1873 shattered the morning silence. The bloodhound didn't even yelp. The snow erupted in a red mist 2 feet in front of the charging dog, throwing snow and ice into its face. The hound scrambled backward in a panic, tumbling down the drift. Down below, Grover panicked, raising his Springfield, scanning the dense tree line above them. Sniper! Up in the pines! Crack! A second shot rang out. Grover's horse reared with a terrified squeal as the bullet struck the dirt merely an inch from its hooves. The tracker lost his balance and fell backward into the deep snow, losing his grip on his rifle. Declan Boyd didn't panic. He moved with terrifying practiced speed. He spurred his horse behind the cover of a massive fallen pine, drawing his Sharps rifle and throwing himself from the saddle in one fluid motion. Who's shooting? Boyd roared. his pale eyes darting across the high ridge. High above, hidden within the thick, drooping boughs of a blue spruce, Caleb Hayes worked the lever of his Winchester, ejecting a smoking brass casing. He had circled around them, moving like a phantom through the snow he knew intimately, gaining the high ground while they were focused on Clara. Name's Caleb Hayes. The mountain man's deep voice echoed down the canyon walls, making it impossible for Boyd to pinpoint his exact location. You're trespassing on my mountain, Boyd, and you're hunting a woman who is under my protection. Clara gasped, looking up toward the trees. He followed me. The stubborn fool followed me. Boyd crouched behind the log, a wicked smile spreading across his face. He recognized the name immediately. Hayes, the deputy marshal from Cheyenne? Boyd called back, genuine amusement in his voice. Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of the territory? They said you ran up here to freeze to death after your brother got his chest blown open. What are you doing playing knight in shining armor for a thief? She's not the thief here, and you know it. Caleb's voice echoed from a different position. He was moving, using the echo to mask his shifting location. Take your tracker, take your dog, and ride back down to Josiah Miller. Tell him this mountain is closed. You know I can't do that, Caleb. Boyd sneered, resting the heavy barrel of the sharps over the log, waiting for a flash of movement. Mr. Miller pays top dollar for loose ends, and frankly, bringing down a legendary lawman like you will look fantastic on my resume. Boyd turned slightly toward his tracker, who was still floundering in the deep snow, trying to reach his dropped rifle. Grover, flush her out of those rocks. I'll keep the lawman pinned. Grover drew a heavy bowie knife and began wading violently through the snow toward Clara's position. Caleb had a choice: shoot the tracker and reveal his position to a master marksman like Boyd, or wait and risk Clara's life. For a man who had sworn off the badge, the instinct to protect was still overwhelmingly loud. Caleb stepped out from behind a massive pine trunk, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder. Crack! The bullet tore through Grover's shoulder, spinning the tracker around and dropping him screaming into the snow. But the muzzle flash was all Boyd needed. The massive Sharps buffalo rifle roared like a cannon. The heavy .50 caliber slug tore through the air, slamming into the pine trunk right next to Caleb's head. The impact exploded the tree bark, sending a shower of lethal wooden shrapnel into Caleb's face and shoulder. Caleb grunted in pain, thrown backward into the snowbank, his Winchester slipping from his grasp as a wave of dizziness hit him. Caleb! Clara screamed, abandoning the safety of the rocks and scrambling toward the tree line where he had fallen. I got him! Boyd shouted triumphantly, abandoning his cover and trudging up the hill, his revolvers drawn. Bring me the bag, Clara, or I'll put a bullet in his skull before he wakes up. Clara reached the tree line, fighting through the thick branches. She found Caleb slumped against the base of a pine, blood trickling down the side of his face from a deep gash caused by the shrapnel. He was conscious, his blue eyes fierce, but his left arm hung uselessly at his side, his shoulder severely bruised or broken from the impact of the wood. You stupid man, Clara sobbed, dropping to her knees beside him. She dropped the heavy satchel and grabbed his coat. I told you to stay in the cabin. I don't take orders well, Caleb gritted out, forcing himself to sit up. He reached down to his hip with his good right hand, drawing the heavy Colt peacemaker. Heavy boots crunched in the snow just beyond the tree line. Declan Boyd stepped through the gap in the pines, his twin revolvers leveled directly at them. The vicious hound paced nervously behind him, whining softly at the smell of blood. Touching, Boyd mocked, stepping into the small clearing under the trees. Truly, a dime novel romance right here in the mud and snow. Kick the gun away, Marshal. Caleb locked eyes with Boyd, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of the Colt. You'll be dead before you cock those hammers, Boyd. Maybe, Boyd conceded with a cold smile, but the second I fall, my finger twitches, and your lovely Miss Jenkins takes a bullet to the stomach. A very slow, very painful way to die in the cold. Put the gun down now. Clara looked at Caleb, shaking her head frantically. Don't do it. But Caleb looked at the twin barrels, pointed at Clara, let out a slow, defeated breath, and tossed the Colt into the snow. Good boy, Boyd sneered. He gestured to the leather bag with his chin. Toss the satchel over here, Clara. Open it first. I want to see the ledgers. Clara hesitated. Her hands went to the brass lock. She fumbled with a small key on a chain around her neck, her hands shaking violently. She popped the lock, pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger, and threw the bag toward Boyd. Boyd stepped forward, keeping his guns trained on them, and kicked the bag open to inspect the contents. Excellent. Mr. Miller will be very pleased. Why does Miller care so much? Caleb rasped, holding his bleeding head. He practically owns the territory. A few corrupt deeds won't bring him down. Boyd chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Oh, Caleb, you really have been living under a rock, haven't you? This isn't just about ranch deeds in the territory. Mr. Miller's ambitions are far grander. And Miss Jenkins here got her hands on the master ledger, the one that ties Miller to the shadow syndicates back east, the one that proves he financed the hostile takeovers of the major cattlemen's banks in Wyoming. Caleb froze. The pain in his head suddenly vanished, replaced by a deafening ringing in his ears. Wyoming. Clara looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. She remembered the names in the ledger, the dates. The Cheyenne bank job, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She looked directly at Caleb. The job in 1882 where your brother was killed. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow burying the mountains. Boyd let out a delighted booming laugh. Oh, this is rich. She didn't tell you? Yes, Hayes. Josiah Miller financed that bank robbery. The local mayor in Cheyenne was just a middleman, a patsy on Miller's payroll. Your brother, Thomas, got in the way of a hostile takeover ordered directly from Bozeman. The men who shot him were Miller's hired guns. Caleb's breath stopped. For 5 years he had lived on this mountain, running from the ghosts of his past. He had blamed the mayor. He had blamed the outlaw gang. He had even blamed himself for not being fast enough to save Thomas. But the real architect of his brother's murder had been sitting in a velvet-lined office in Bozeman the entire time, and the proof, the absolute damning proof, was sitting in the snow 10 feet away. A terrifying preternatural calm settled over Caleb. The wounded, bleeding mountain man disappeared, and the legendary lawman of Cheyenne took his place. You shouldn't have told me that, Boyd, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. What are you going to do about it, crippled man? Boyd taunted, aiming his right revolver squarely at Caleb's chest. You're out of plays. Not quite. Caleb's eyes flicked to Clara. Clara, the Derringer, now. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't think. Driven by pure adrenaline and absolute trust in the man beside her, she reached into her pocket, drew the tiny nickel-plated gun, and tossed it blindly toward Caleb's right hand. Boyd's eyes widened. He swung his gun toward Clara to shoot her for the sudden movement, but Caleb was faster. He caught the Derringer in midair, snapping his wrist up in one fluid, blindingly fast motion. Bang! The small gun fired. It wasn't a powerful weapon, but at 10 feet, it didn't need to be. The bullet struck Boyd directly in the right wrist. The bounty hunter screamed, dropping his revolver into the snow as his bones shattered. Before Boyd could bring his left gun up, Caleb lunged forward off his knees, ignoring the agonizing pain in his shoulder. He tackled Boyd around the waist, driving the bounty hunter backward into the deep snowdrift. The two men rolled violently down the embankment. Boyd fought like a cornered wolverine, bringing his heavy boots up and kicking Caleb in the chest. Caleb groaned, rolling off, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a handful of Boyd's heavy duster and dragged him face first into the trunk of a fallen tree. Boyd, dazed, desperately reached for the hunting knife on his belt. But Caleb was fueled by 5 years of dormant rage and the fresh, burning revelation of his brother's true killer. Caleb grabbed Boyd's arm, twisted it violently until he heard a sickening pop, and drove his knee into Boyd's chest, pinning him to the frozen earth. He grabbed Boyd by the collar, hauling him up so they were face to face. "You tell Josiah Miller," Caleb snarled, his eyes burning with a terrifying, righteous fury. "You tell him Caleb Hayes knows the truth. You tell him that the ghost of Cheyenne is coming down off this mountain." Caleb brought his heavy, calloused fist down in a brutal arc, striking Boyd squarely in the jaw. The bounty hunter's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp, collapsing into the snow. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the ragged breathing of the mountain man and the distant whimpering of the fleeing bloodhound. Clara slid down the embankment, clutching the ledger to her chest, her eyes wide as she looked at Caleb kneeling over the unconscious bounty hunter. Caleb slowly pushed himself up, holding his battered ribs. He looked at Clara, then down at the leather book in her hands, the book that held his brother's justice, the book that had brought the war directly to his doorstep. He reached out his right hand, wiping the blood from his cheek. "Give me the ledger, Clara," Caleb said, his voice hard, resolute, and completely transformed. "We have a train to catch to Helena." They bound Declan Boyd and the bleeding tracker with heavy hemp rope, leaving them in the shelter of the rocks with just enough firewood to survive the night. Caleb wasn't a murderer, despite the rage boiling in his veins. The mountain would decide their fate, or the local sheriff would find them when the snow finally melted. The journey down the Bitterroots slopes was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. Caleb's left shoulder was swollen and throbbing from the shrapnel impact, forcing him to rely entirely on his right arm to guide Boyd's confiscated horses through the deep drifts. Clara rode closely beside him, the heavy leather satchel strapped securely across her chest. Over the next 2 days, the frozen wilderness tested their limits, but it also forged an unbreakable bond between them. In the quiet, shivering darkness of their makeshift camps, Clara would carefully clean the gash on Caleb's head, her delicate fingers ghosting over his rugged, weathered skin. Caleb, in turn, watched her with a newfound reverence. She wasn't just a city girl anymore. She was the fiercest fighter he had ever met. In the reflection of the campfire, beneath the vast, indifferent canopy of the Montana stars, the ice around Caleb's heart, frozen solid since his brother's murder, finally began to melt. He found himself looking at her amber eyes and realizing that his isolated sanctuary on the mountain felt painfully empty without her in it. By the time they reached the valley railhead at Missoula, the world had changed from white wilderness to the muddy, bustling reality of the expanding West. They boarded the eastbound Northern Pacific train, securing a private compartment. The rhythmic clacking of the iron wheels on steel tracks was a stark contrast to the dead silence of the high timberline. "We need to find Judge Hiram Knowles," Caleb said quietly, watching the snow-capped peaks roll past the frosted window. "He's presiding over the federal district court in Helena. I worked with him back in '83. He's a hard man, but he's honest. He won't be bought by Miller's Syndicate." Clara clutched the satchel on her lap, her knuckles white. "Josiah Miller has spies at every rail station between Bozeman and Helena. As soon as we step off this train in Last Chance Gulch, he'll know we're there." "I'm counting on it," Caleb replied, his blue eyes hardening into steel. "I don't just want to hand over the evidence. I want Miller to look me in the eye when his empire burns." The train hissed into the Helena station. Just as the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long bloody shadows across the bustling mining town, Helena was a city of extreme wealth and cutthroat politics, its streets lined with grand stone architecture built on gold dust and blood. Caleb and Clara moved quickly through the crowded platform, avoiding the main thoroughfares. They navigated the icy alleys behind the Grand Cosmopolitan Hotel, making their way toward the federal courthouse. But as they approached the heavy oak doors of the judge's chamber, the shadows in the alleyway detached themselves. 3 men in heavy wool coats stepped into the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Their hands hovered over their holstered revolvers. And stepping out from behind them, wrapped in an expensive beaver fur coat and smoking a thin cigar, was Josiah Miller. "Mr. Hayes, I presume," Miller said, his voice as smooth and suffocating as velvet. He was an older man, distinguished, with a silver pocket watch chain glinting against his silk vest. "And my wayward bookkeeper, Clara, my dear, you have caused a tremendous amount of trouble for a ledger full of meaningless numbers." Caleb immediately stepped in front of Clara, his right hand resting mere inches from the grip of his Colt. "The numbers are meaningless. The names and dates detailing my brother's murder in Cheyenne, however, mean quite a bit to me, Miller." Miller sighed, taking a long drag from his cigar. "Oh, the Cheyenne business. A tragedy, truly. But business is business, Mr. Hayes. Progress requires a certain amount of clearing the brush. Now, I'll make you a very generous offer. Leave the bag on the snow. Walk away. I'll even finance a new cabin for you, far away from here. If you draw that gun, my men will cut you and the girl to ribbons before the hammer drops." "You're a confident man, Josiah," Caleb said, his voice remarkably calm. He didn't move his hand toward his gun. Instead, he took a step back, standing shoulder to shoulder with Clara. "But you're forgetting one thing." "And what is that?" Miller sneered. "I didn't bring Clara here to hide her behind my coat," Caleb said, a fierce, proud smile touching his lips. "I brought her because she's smarter than you." Clara stepped forward, her amber eyes burning with a fiery defiance that made Miller's smug expression falter. She didn't reach for her derringer. Instead, she reached into the heavy leather satchel and pulled out the thick ledger. With a swift, shocking motion, she tossed the book directly into a burning trash barrel sitting in the alleyway. Miller gazed, his eyes widening as the flames licked hungrily at the leather binding, instantly consuming the pages. "Are you insane?" Miller roared, stepping forward. "You just burned your only leverage." "No, Josiah," Clara said, her voice echoing sharply against the brick walls. "I burned your original copies, because 2 days ago, while Caleb was fighting your bounty hunter on the mountain, I wasn't just hiding. I made a stop at a telegraph relay station in the valley before I headed up the Bitterroots." Miller stopped dead, his face draining of color. "I transcribed every name, every date, and every bank routing number tied to your hired killers," Clara continued, her voice ringing with absolute triumph. "And I wired it directly to the office of the United States Attorney General in Washington, D.C., and to U.S. Marshal William F. Wheeler right here in Helena." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open behind them. Marshal William Wheeler, a legendary lawman with a thick mustache and a double-barreled shotgun resting easily in his arms, stepped out into the cold night air. Behind him stood Judge Hiram Knowles, flanked by a half-dozen heavily armed federal deputies. "Evening, Josiah," Marshal Wheeler boomed, the sound of a dozen rifles cocking echoing in the alleyway. "We received Miss Jenkins' telegram. Been waiting for you to show your face. You're under federal arrest for racketeering, bribery, and the murder of Deputy Marshal Thomas Hayes." Miller's composure shattered. Realizing his empire was crumbling in real time, panic overtook his aristocratic facade. With a desperate snarl, he reached inside his fur coat for a hidden shoulder holster. He never cleared the leather. Caleb's draw was blinding, a phantom motion honed by years of survival. The Colt peacemaker roared, a flash of fire illuminating the dark alley. Miller screamed, his hidden pistol clattering to the icy cobblestones as Caleb's bullet shattered his collarbone, dropping the syndicate boss to his knees in the snow. The 3 hired thugs immediately threw their hands in the air, surrendering to the federal deputies who swarmed the alley. Caleb walked slowly over to where Miller was writhing on the ground. He looked down at the man who had ordered his brother's death, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. For 5 years he had dreamed of killing this man. But as he looked over his shoulder at Clara, standing tall, brave, and bathed in the warm glow of the street lamp, the ghosts of his past finally went quiet. He didn't need blood anymore. He had justice. Caleb lowered the hammer of his Colt and holstered the gun. He turned his back on Josiah Miller, leaving him to the federal marshals. He walked back to Clara, whose hands were finally trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Without a word, Caleb reached out with his good arm and pulled her against his chest. She buried her face in his heavy wool coat, breathing in the scent of pine and gunpowder, the cold winter air completely forgotten in the warmth of his embrace. "It's over," Caleb whispered into her hair, resting his chin on her head. "You did it, Clara." She looked up at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, but a radiant smile breaking through her exhaustion. "We did it." She paused, looking into his bruised, beautiful eyes. "So, what happens to the lonely mountain man now?" Caleb looked past the brick buildings, out toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "I think the mountain is going to need a bigger cabin," he said softly, leaning down to press a gentle, lingering kiss to her lips. "Because it's freezing outside, and I never want to be out in the cold without you again." Did Clara and Caleb's harrowing fight for justice and love in the frozen Bitterroots keep you on the edge of your seat? The Wild West was a brutal place, but as this story shows, true grit and a desperate leap of faith can melt even the coldest of hearts. If you love this thrilling tale of survival, betrayal, and romance, please hit that like button and share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another dramatic, real-life inspired Western adventure. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.